Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to see all of you here. We have a lot of announcements and demos throughout the session. It's going to be a really jam-packed session. We have a lot of content to cover. It's meant to be a deep dive session. It's a part 2 of the overview and best practices session that Satya and Joseph went over on Tuesday. How many of you were there at the session? Okay, majority of you, good. For those who haven't listened in, I highly recommend that you watch it. We are going to skip over the whole content that was in that earlier session for saving the time for deep dive content. In today's session, we'll be going over 4 services. I'll go through management group and policy first, and then Tigran will go over Azure Resource Graph, and then Alex will come up for Blueprint deep dive as well. So let's get started with Azure Management Group. Azure Management Group allows you to group your subscriptions together so that you can create an organizational hierarchy. The beauty of Management Group is that it's embedded as a part of ARM. It's a recognized artifact so that you can have a RBAC access to it, as well as policy, security center, blueprint. All these services are able to snap to it for controls at scale. The way that we recommend management groups to be created is that you separate out your production environment from pre-production environment like dev or test, because the RBAC that you provide and the policies that you put in place will differ. Production obviously will be much more restrictive in terms of the controls as well as the access, whereas pre-production environment may be more cost sensitive but not as restrictive on the access front. So I'll go straight into the demo of the management group. As I mentioned earlier, management group allows you to create an organizational hierarchy. So it can be up to 6 levels deep. And then up at the top, there's what we call the root management group. The root management group essentially represents your tenant. So all of your subscriptions within the tenant automatically belong in there, so that if you have a control that needs to go in place, you just provide it at the root management group level. And any new subscriptions that get created afterwards will automatically belong under that root management group and hence get the control. Here I have a Contoso management group that I'll drill into. I have some additional hierarchies underneath. If I look into the IT and then infrastructure management group, under the if I drill in to see the access control, when it loads, you'll see that some of the users have that parenthesis inherited section. That means that they don't actually have access to the management group directly, but they have something they have access to the parent management group, and that access automatically inherits downwards. If I don't have access to the parent management group and only at this level, whether it be an infrastructure team management group or the subscription underneath, I don't have the access to either remove the RBAC access or the policy. And so this is the inherited access where if you put something at the top, people underneath will just have to abide by it. Another thing I want to show you is how it will look on policy. So you can see over here, I have a subscription called Contoso IT Demo Subscription, which belongs to a management group called Contoso. But the compliance information that I see over here is strictly based on the access that I have. So this is based on the subscription that I have access to rather than the entire environment. Because when you put in the control at the root management group, you're not the one that needs to make sure that all of the resources become compliant, right? You have application teams, subscription owners who needs to actually check their compliance state to know what resources they need to fix. So that's why even if you have access to 2 subscriptions out of like 10,000 subscriptions within the management group, the compliance information, you'll be able to see it for those 2 subscriptions, as well as the policy assignment and definition details. Also, I can see the management group names that are above my hierarchy as well. I just won't be able to click onto them or be able to see additional details. So just a few key pointers around management group. First of all, it's kind of already there. The root management group essentially is your tenant. The backfill, so the backfill for having all of the subscriptions in the management group is not enabled by default. All you have to do to trigger it is just to create a management group within the tenant, which you can do as long as you own a subscription. So once you trigger the management group, the root management group will start the backfill so that you have all of your subscriptions underneath. So you don't have to wait until you figure out the entire organizational hierarchy and all of the subscriptions and whatnot. And even if you get wrong in terms of the organizational hierarchy, it's very easy for you to change it later. So get started with using the root management group. The second part is that inheritance obviously is a powerful and dangerous thing. If you provide someone owner access to the root management group, that person has owner access to entire subscriptions within the tenant. So just be aware of it, use it wisely. Don't put in a deny policy on day one and just block all of the deployments. And then last part is that we recently released a built-in RBAC roles for management group so that if somebody needs to just have the access to change the hierarchy of the management groups, we provide it through MG contributor, and then we also have a MG reader role to be able to read the details of the management groups. Now let's go over Azure Policy. Azure Policy is a fairly new service. We launched limited public preview last Ignite. But between now and last year, there's been a lot of implementation and a lot of the new features that we've introduced. December, we went public preview. We also introduced the management group support. Another thing we introduced is a delta scan of compliance so that whenever there's a resource change, within 15 minutes, we update the compliance information as well. We went GA in May, where we also announced that Azure Policy is completely free. Please go use it. It doesn't cost anything for you to use it. We are also in all national clouds for US, China, Germany, and whatnot. Lastly, today, so fast forward to today, this Ignite, we have a lot of features that we are releasing mainly for remediation, compliance improvement, language support, denied due to policy experience improvement. And I'll cover most of these during my demo today. And so we have a lot of content to cover, and so I'm just going to get started. Policy is divided in three main pillars in terms of the functionality. The first is around enforcement and compliance. The second part is around applying policies at scale, which is the management group support. And the third is remediation. And so at Ignite this year, we introduced the new auto remediation capability as well as remediation on existing resources. To get started on remediation, it's super simple. We already have built-in definitions available for you. So if you're brand new to policy and go under definitions, these definitions are already on your environment. And these are some of the deploy if not exist policy that are in place. So let's see what the definition looks like. First of all, for the remediation capability, the effect has to be deploy if not exist. And that's where we know that this is meant to be a remediation policy. And then what we have is the ARM template. And so this is how we know what action we need to take to remediate the resource. And so essentially what we're doing is if we detect that the resource is non-compliant, we are just deploying the ARM template to remediate the resource. And so you provide the ARM template. And then one thing you may notice is that there's a role definition ID. Let me just zoom in here. The role definition ID. So when we remediate these resources, we need to have the right credentials to actually deploy these ARM template to actually trigger the remediation actions. And so what we are using is called managed identity. Essentially, it allows us our policy assignments to be like a person. So the assignment itself will get a RBAC access, like a person would, and it will get its own identity for RBAC access as well. And so when we are giving the access to the assignment, we need to know what kind of rights we should give. Should we give the owner rights? Do we need to give log analytics contributor rights? Do we need to give storage account contributor rights? And so this is where you specify the role definition ID. Now that our policy definition is ready, let's get started on assigning the policy. You can see here the managed identity is checked by default. I can select a location of my identity, which doesn't make much difference. So regardless of which location you choose for your identity, we will be able to remediate resources in any regions because the identity is replicated in any regions. And then you can see over here that I have a SQL Security Manager access that I need to be able to remediate the resource. And the SQL Security Manager is where the role definition ID specified for the GUID. Now, let's say that when you're writing your custom policy definition, you forgot to put in the role definition ID, or maybe you put in a wrong role definition, or you just forgot the managed identity overall. The error that you receive will be something similar to this one. So I created a policy where I knew that I didn't create the right role definition ID. And so it has failed. And so when I look at the related events, it'll say that the assignment does not have the necessary permissions. And so this is how I know that my role definition ID didn't have proper access. Now that we went through how you would go about creating a remediation assignment, let's look at how you would remediate. So first of all, when you put in a deploy if not exist policy, any new resources that get created or existing resources that get updated automatically get the remediation. And so you don't have to worry about them for the greenfield scenarios. For existing resources, we don't touch them by default. We will only mark them as non-compliant, and it's up to the user to actually create a remediation task to trigger the remediation action. And so, for example, I have an initiative over here to enable diagnostic logs for all of my resources. I'm going to choose one for SQL. And over here, you can see the list of the resources that's going to get the remediation actions. I can go at the level of the assignment. I can also start from a smaller scope. So I can choose to go from a, actually, I'm not going to choose on the smaller scope. Or I can go based on the location. So I don't want to roll out across all regions. I want to go region by region by region basis. Then I can just select a region that I'm interested in. And you can see here that now there are 2 resources that will get the remediation actions. I click on to remediate, and that's it. Now the remediation actions are triggered. I'll wait for it to go. Yep. So you can see over here now the remediation actions are in progress. And so that is how you can get started on remediation. As I mentioned earlier, it's super simple to get started, so I highly recommend for you to try it out, because at the end of the day, these non-compliant resources need to turn compliant one way or the other. Now let's talk about compliance. There's been a lot of the changes that we made for Ignite this year around our compliance experience. One of it being the first thing that you may notice if you're already familiar with our experience is that we now have a compliance percentage. So overall, across my environment, in this example for my subscription, I can also select a management group, for example, for my org. I can see that I'm currently 29% compliant, and that I have 64 policies that I'm non-compliant against. I can easily drill down to these initiatives to see the breakdown of which policy I'm non-compliant against, as well as which resources are non-compliant. Taking a little bit of time. Let me go into a different one. OK, we'll start from here. So you can see over here, there's a breakdown of the resources that I'm non-compliant against. I can also drill down to an individual policy to see the breakdowns as well. One of the new things that we introduced for Ignite is that you can now see the compliant resources as well, not just non-compliant, which unfortunately I don't have any compliant resources in this environment. And also, I have a last evaluated column all the way to the end. And that is the last time that the resource was evaluated to the policy. And so if you're running into a caching issue, or if you just made a change to the resource and you're wondering, has this been updated yet? You can see right over here to see when it got last reevaluated. In relation to that, I've been getting a lot of questions around how often do we evaluate policy? Is it every 24 hours? Do I need to trigger it every time? And so there's different times in which we evaluate it. So first of all, when you make a brand new assignment and save it, we do the full scan. And so we evaluate every resource that you have on your environment and give a state of compliant, non-compliant, or not applicable per policy. After that, whenever there's a resource change, we do what we call delta scan. And so we'll evaluate just that resource and update the compliance state. And that usually gets reflected within about 15 minutes of the resource change. We also have a periodic scan as well. So every 24 hours, we do full snapshots again, just in case there was any drift that we did not catch. Lastly, we have a private preview of the trigger scan API, also some people know as the on-demand scan API, so that if you want to trigger the compliance on your scope, so like a subscription or a resource group, you can call the API to actually have that fully triggered. I was discussing with my engineering team yesterday, and we were saying, you know, this trigger scan API, it's really our customers have been really wanting to have it, and so we should really make sure that our most valuable customers get access to it first. And who better customers than someone who's willing to come to the session at 4 p.m. on the day that we have Universal Studio visit later on. And so here's how you call the trigger scan API. We do throttle you, so don't go crazy on it. You can only call it 10 times an hour. But here's the post call that you would do to trigger it for a given scope. In this example, I'm calling it for a resource group. When you make this call, this is what it will return. You'll get a hyperlink of the location. Then you do another GET call to that hyperlink that it provided. And it will return 202 if it's accepted and the scan is ongoing, or 200 if it has finished the scan, and so the compliance result has been updated. Now that we know how we can trigger the compliance, let's talk about the compliance information. So I just showed you on our compliance percentage as to how you're able to see across your environment that you are 23% compliant, for example. One of the struggle that we had when we were planning on introducing compliance percentage was that let's say that you have a policy in place that says that SQL encryption must be enabled. And you have 2 SQL databases, you have 3 VMs. 2 of the SQL databases don't have the encryption on. It's turned off. It would be logical that you would think that it's 0% compliant because 2 out of 2 resources have the encryption disabled. But from policy engine perspective, we evaluate every resource. And so we'll say the VM is compliant. VM compliant because it didn't meet the requirement of the policy. And so the policy engine will think that you're actually 60% compliant, which skews your compliance numbers. And so on the back end, we actually implemented what we call applicability so that when we introduce our compliance percentage, the total numbers that you see is actually based on what your policy definition intended to be applicable. And so in this example, I have 74 virtual machines and 10 SQL databases. So how do we get the number? You may not care. Hopefully, it'll just work like a magic, that you never have to think about it. It's completely intuitive. But just in case you're interested, the way that we run applicability is that we actually evaluate the policy twice. So we do the real evaluation of your policy, but we also do what we call applicability evaluation, where we will ignore everything that's in your policy definition except for the type field. And so in this example, if the resource that came through is type equals virtual machine, then it's applicable. If the resource that went through does not meet type equals virtual machine, then it is not applicable. And there's a few edge cases that we also addressed as well, but this is kind of the way that we are inferring the intention of your policy definition. Now let's go over the policy enforcement. So when, as some of you may be familiar, behind Azure Policy, we have two engines underneath it. One is for our real-time enforcement, and the other one is for compliance evaluation. And so when a resource comes in, we will actually evaluate the resource before it actually gets created. Policy is embedded as part of the front door to ARM, so that we get the request first, and so that allows us to do a real-time enforcement and deny the resource before it gets created if it's not abiding to the policy. Otherwise, if it meets the policies, then we'll just let the resource request go through. Now, common questions that we've been receiving is, if I have a policy to the management group level, and somebody goes and assigns a policy to the resource group level, then is there some kind of hierarchy to these policies? And the answer to that is no, because policy is a violation-based system. So the more policies you assign, the more restrictive your environment becomes. It doesn't create some kind of a loophole that customer can create for that becomes allowed. Everything is just more restrictive the more policies you have. So in the worst case scenario, nobody can create anything. But there are orders in which we run our policies. And so for when a resource request comes through, what we do is we check whether the list of policies that this resource needs to be evaluated against. And then we'll run all of the append policies first, because that actually changes the resource content. And so, for example, if you have an append policy to put a tag onto the resource, by the time the deny policy comes in, if you are to deny the resource that doesn't have tags, it'll actually change it so that you do have the tags at that point. And so we run append policy first, and then deny, and then we run the audit. At this point, we actually let the resource request go through. We wait 10 minutes to ensure that the policy actually does get created. And then we run our if not exist conditions. And so the deploy if not exist, our remediations effect that you saw earlier, as well as audit if not exist, actually happens after the fact, because we need to ensure that the resource actually got created. The resource request may have failed because of some other deployment issues. And so that's the last policy evaluations that we run. It's fully well documented, but in terms of the number of policies that you can have in a given scope, a scope is a resource group, subscription management group. You have the limit per scope. And so we can have up to 100 policy definitions, as well as 100 policy set is an initiative. So 100 policies within an initiative, and then 100 assignments. So if you create initiative and max out each of the initiative and put that on a given scope, essentially there will be a maximum 10,000 policies running in a given scope. And if you end up hitting any of these limits, please just talk to us. We've increased the limits, for example, for parameters already, so we're more than willing to up the limits based on the customer needs. Also, all of the events that we take place, so audit, append, deny, deploy if not exist, audit if not exist, everything is recorded onto Azure Activity Log. And so if you want to get alerted anytime a resource turned non-compliant, create an alert off of the Azure Activity Log. We also have an Azure Policy GitHub for someone who's looking for additional samples of policy definitions. So you can go over here to see what other policy samples are out there beyond our built-in policies. Now let's talk about roadmap. So with everything that we released at Ignite, there's so much more that needs to come. Every time we talk with customers, we always get exciting ideas and additional features that we want to get implemented. So one of the items that's coming is our auto-generation of aliases. Today, alias is essentially a configuration of a resource. And it's something that we need to manually add onto our alias support for each of the configurations. You can see our latest aliases that's supported through the PowerShell and API. But we want to be able to get to a place where we cover 99% of our aliases. And so some of you may have already started putting in the request onto our Azure Policy GitHub where you can request aliases. But we are also, in parallel to that, have work going on so that we can broadly support aliases across all of the Azure resources. And so that is a work that's going to be in progress over the next few months. Regex also has been enormously popular. Our regex support right now, it's a little bit embarrassing to call it regex support. So we have more items that we are going to look into, especially for your naming convention policies. We are going to look into supporting additional regex capabilities. I won't be going through each of the items, but I do want to highlight the fact that we have in-guest policy public preview at Ignite this year. If you go to Azure Policy today, these are already built in. You can only assign it as an initiative level because we actually need the guest configuration agent to be deployed. But in-guest policy can actually look within a virtual machine to see, for example, if your password is secure. So it's super easy to get started. You just assign that initiative and that's it. But it's a simple way for you to kind of get an idea of how secure your passwords are. And then over the coming weeks, we'll also have much more initiatives coming down the pipeline. And then obviously, as a roadmap, we plan on supporting custom policy definitions for that as well. You may have seen some of the demos being done around Azure DevOps. We have an integration happening within Azure DevOps so that when you have a policy violation, instead of knowing it at the very end after you've deployed everything, we brought that error forward so that at the build time, it'll give you the violation message. And this is something that we are just getting started on. There's much more investment that we would like to do down the road. And so with that, please fill out the survey because this is how we know how we need to prioritize our feature requests and also see what else needs to be implemented. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tigran Shabazian, and I'm Program Manager at Azure Governance Team. And today I'm going to introduce you to Resource Graph. And some of you I know have been on the previous session and saw some glimpse of like basic queries. And I will try to take you through the journey, how you can learn how to interact with Resource Graph in order to implement governance at scale in your environment. Now, what is Azure Resource Graph? Resource Graph is a new Azure platform capability that provides you resource exploration at scale. It gives you full visibility into your cloud environment across all your subscriptions or management groups, as well as helps you with policy definition and provides instant policy impact analysis. Now, on the previous session, when Joseph Chan and Satya Vel was asking, some of you raised your hand when he asked, like, how many of you try to count your resources across all your subscriptions? And some of you even smiled, right? So it turns out that it's not a simple task without scripting. So it used to be not a simple task. Now, with Resource Graph, let me show you how quickly it can be done. And this is a basic query you have seen. I will execute, but I will take you to the next level. And I will show how easy I can group by type, resource type, and get the results. I can group by location and order data, like let's say order by count. Okay, and even make it nicer. And now, oops, something here, count or output. Good, thank you. Put. So, okay, I'll fix it. Let me execute without, so I did a typo here. So It's supposed to work. Or by count underscore. Sorry, my bad. So that's right now what I got here is a number of location, but it's not readable, so maybe I will do output table. And now what I will get, this is like the list of all my resources in each location. Now, I can also group by several things, like for example, location and subscription ID. Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, now this will give me the list that group by 2 different fields, right? So what you have seen right now, it's kind of analytical, different slice and dicing functionality, but I'll take you through another example which is more relevant when you're governing your environment. For example, if you have a need to find all Linux VMs with specific vulnerable operating system version, how would you do it? In the past, it sounds simple that requirement is so simple, right? But it turns out that it took serious effort from cloud engineer to go over and write a script which requires you to understand our model, different versions of resource providers. Also, when you write a script which should go through each and every subscription, then finally you had to execute it against ARM, and in most of the cases, your script will not be successfully completed because of ARM throttling. And if you have a large-scale environment, this simple question to count the vulnerable Linux machine can take you hours, sometimes even days. So here is a query in resource graph which returns you the same thing that same vulnerable operating virtual machines with operating system. So it's pretty short, right? Can you, should I zoom in or you can see it? Okay, I'll try to zoom just in case. Okay, this is a query. So you can see I'm using alias to refer to the operating system and also property for a specific version. And if I will execute this query, within second, it will give me count immediately for me. Now, so it doesn't matter how big is your environment, the performance of the query will be as fast as it is now, because you can think about resource graph as a cache. We are basically caching all information and storing, and it's available to use that query language, which is similar to log analytics query language. How many of you are familiar with log analytics? I see a lot of hands. Whoever is not familiar, we have a good documentation that I will introduce the location also, where you can learn about language, the query language. Now, we are using a subset of operators from log analytics language, which allows you to filter, group by, sort, pipe, and as you have seen, there's a multiple piping I was using in my query previously. So that's something that good enough for you to find things. And let me show you how you're getting started with resource graph. So resource graph has a page, dedicated page, that is available within policy. You see, within policy, there's a new page, and if you, for some reason, cannot find it, you can always type here graph, and in search, it will find, actually, resource graph. Okay, and you can just directly open it from here. Now, this page is summarizing all information that you need to know about how to start with resource graph. Now, resource graph is by default enabled for everyone. It's part of platform, so it's always on and knows about all your resources. Now, the latency between when resource created, under 1 minute, we will get all changes, and for 95% of the cases, the resource graph will be up to date under 1 minute. And what else is important? In order to access to the module and start querying, like perform rich queries, the way I did it, you need to enable a module or either on PowerShell or CLI. And in order to do that, there is a simple command. Let me zoom in. Oops, too much. OK, so this is the extension add name resource graph. You need to run it once for your user, and it will enable, and you will be able to run the queries. This page also have a bunch of examples that you can just copy-paste and start exploring at scale your environment and get the results. And this way, you can learn the query as well as explore your environment. So let me copy-paste something from the example. So this query will return all my operating systems and their versions. You see, like this is like the simple task right now. Before it was really complicated. Now, let's go through another example. So this is actually the example came from a real customer. One second. OK, so one of our customers asked us if we can help them to find cloud storage accounts that are exposed to all networks. They tried to do in their environment because there was a security data breach, and they figured out they need to tighten some rules across all their environment. And they tried to script everything to find those potential vulnerable cloud storage account. It took them several days, and then they reached out to us, and we onboarded them on a preview of resource graph. And let me show you how we did it for them and how we went through the journey. First, I went to the UI of storage account, and in firewall rules, found the setting that controls access from network. This setting is nice UI setting here, but when I find it, I still don't know which property of the resource responsible for each settings that I see here. So what I did, I created test account one time with one setting and changed the setting, and I dumped the all properties of the resource using resource graph into the file. And let me show you how I did it. So here, this is a query that I just ran. Oops, Control-V, paste. So you can see AZ graph query and where name equal to the name that I created. And then I'm just dumping to the file. I will look at the properties of that file right now in JSON format. So this is an editor that I'm showing you right now. Let me open it. OK, so this file is listing all properties and their values. And you can see there's a lot of aliases. It's starting with aliases. And there's a lot of property values here. But for me to find out what exactly has changed, so what I'm doing, I will do diff between two files that I stored. OK, diff. OK, diff. One file I started with, I called it before, and another is after. And now, what I will get in the result is a change of the resource property that I'm looking for. Now, when I know the property, all I need to do is construct a query that will look for those storage accounts. And I spent time to write a query. So let me zoom it in. So this is a query. It looks pretty simple, saying that where type equal storage account, and this alias is basically allow. When it's allow, it means like allow from all networks. And I will count it. So now what I will do it, I will execute this query in my environment, and we'll find how many I have. Oh, graph query minus Q, $, query, and it's query 7. OK. Now, I have in my environment more than 1,000 storage accounts that are vulnerable, kind of according to the rule. They have the rules for that. But I need only those that are in my production environment. So I will refine this query even further, and I will add where tag environment equal to production. So, and I will see how many of those I have in my production environment. So I have only 23. Now, when I have that query, my next step, I would like to create a policy which will deny any resource creation, which will allow, like storage accounts, which will allow network traffic from all networks. So one way is like to struggle and figure it out how to write that policy language in JSON format. But we have a tool, a GitHub tool, which is available to download from this link, which will do that for you. And now I will copy entire thing here, and we will paste. So this tool will take same queries that I executed and will create policy definition with effect deny. And now the result of this query, let me show the result, is a policy definition rule that I can copy paste into my policy editor that Liz was demoing. But I will not do that, and I will be a little bit lazy because I'm not good at typing. Let me see. Scroll. I will use one more flag here, minus minus create. And now what I will do, I will create this policy rule directly in my policy definitions. And let me show you. OK, so one of my screens here supposed to be policy definitions, but if not, I will open. OK, so in definition, I will search for the one that I just created. And this is directly here. So now, when I have this policy definition, all I need to do is to select this policy and assign to certain scope. Now, two things it will do for me. Because it's deny policy, right? It's a policy will watch 24/7, will not allow any new storage account be created that will allow that network. That's good. I'm covered from that perspective. But I still have a lot of storage accounts that I have in my environment. So all those policy will mark as non-compliant. And this way, basically, I will cover that scenario. So what you have seen right now, I started with started with a governance scenario. I took tool that I had to analyze and find out which property I need to look after. I created a query with resource graph and used another tool to convert the query to policy. And this is kind of workflow right now, what I went through. And this way, I helped the customers. And now, when you have seen this, now you can use resource graph and the queries to explore your environment and govern your environment at scale with this tool. Now, how many of you are familiar with this view, browse all view in the portal? Can you raise? Good. So this view is actually most used page across all Azure, but it actually right now has a serious limitation. It's showing only 2,000 resources at a time. Now, with new version, there's a try preview. The preview version of this view will not have any limitation because it's backed up by resource graph. Resource graph is as a backend powering this view. And now, if you see here, I have all my records available for me. So now this view also available for you to explore your resources at scale. Okay. Now, few words about what's next for resource graph. So you have seen that we basically used CLI module to create a query, but we understand that it's kind of not easy for most of the people. They don't remember syntax and all this. That the Query Explorer, which is a UI tool, is one of the things that we will be investing as the next thing. Also, the language that you have seen that we used for query exploration and for definition policy, there are two different languages, so there's a gap. So we are going to fix by addressing that gap. So policy definition will be also, we will make sure that it will also be defined by same language that you used for exploration. So that's another investment we will be doing. And also, who has multiple tenants? They need to deal with multiple tenants. Perfect. So we are going to enable resource exploration at scale across tenant for you. This is on roadmap. So we'll address that. And whoever familiar with Microsoft Graph, from Microsoft Graph, today you cannot get Azure resources, and post-integration, which we will be addressing in the next 6 to 8 months, you will be able to retrieve data from Azure as well. And of course, as you have seen, there's more and more pages within Portal that we will light up to work it at scale by backing up and powering by a resource graph. And with this, I would like to stop here and invite Alex, who will be talking about Blueprint. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Just a few more minutes and then we can all go ride roller coasters. Okay, so as Tigran said, my name's Alex Frankel. I'm the PM responsible for Azure Blueprints. Has anybody in the room at this point not heard about Blueprints this week? Yeah, we've been very subtle with the announcements. So just a very quick refresher, what is a blueprint? It allows you to deploy and update cloud environments in a repeatable manner using composable artifacts. What is an artifact? An artifact are your RBAC assignments, your policy assignments, and your ARM templates for all of your resources. That's a blueprint. And the idea is it helps you stamp out lots of cloud environments really, really quickly and help you manage those environments over time. Now, most of this is going to be demo, but I want to cover just a few things before I get into that. Probably the thing I get asked most often about blueprints is, I can do most of this in ARM, Alex. Why do I need blueprints? I want to be clear, we love ARM. We think ARM is a really fundamental building block of how you should use Azure. If you want to be on the bleeding edge of Azure, you should be using ARM templates. Where it gets challenging is when you start to scale up your usage of ARM. How do you use ARM templates when you have 50 app teams, or 100 app teams, or 1,000 app teams? How do you keep those templates modular to ensure maximum reuse of those templates? And probably most importantly, how do you make sure that those environments stay up to date over time? This is where things start to break down a little bit. This is when you start writing some custom orchestration, PowerShell, and C#, and all of a sudden you have a whole engineering team dedicated just to getting these resources deployed in Azure. And we think it should be easier to deploy and update these cloud environments over time. And that's really what Blueprints is about. It's about creating these packages for environments and then having a native object in Azure that knows about all the environments so that it's easy to update those environments and keep those environments up to date. So with that, I'm going to be demoing for the rest of my time here. I'm going to try to get through as much content about blueprints as possible. Since we just announced on Monday, I want to go through sort of like 0 to 100. And of course, you can watch this session recorded after the fact in case I go a little bit too fast. Okay, so most of you I saw were at the Tuesday session when we did the overview. And so you saw Satya put together a basic blueprint that covers the types of artifacts that you can add to it. And we're really just going to pick up right where he left off. So we have a basic blueprint here. We have the subscription called out. Of course, because it's a definition, we haven't chosen what environment we're going to target yet. This is just to help you orient yourself in terms of what this blueprint is going to do. We have a resource group called out here for networking. Again, this is a placeholder that will get created when the blueprint gets assigned. And then we have the 3 other types of artifacts that we can add to a blueprint. We have an RBAC assignment. We have the networking team being added here. An ARM template that creates a virtual network. And then we have a policy. It's actually a custom policy that restricts inbound and outbound ports for your NSGs. So what we haven't really dove into that much yet is what is it like to assign a blueprint? What are sort of those key fields that are really important to understand when you're assigning a blueprint? So let's walk through that. So first, we're going to pick our subscription. That's fairly self-explanatory. We're just going to do one subscription with this particular assignment. But of course, you could multi-select here and stamp out the same environment across many subscriptions in a single assignment process. The assignment name. So we allow you to assign the same blueprint to the same subscription more than once in the case of sort of shared subscription scenarios. So we need an assignment object name to keep track of those different blueprint assignments. The location here, that's also for the managed identity that Liz talked about in policy. And this is a really important concept, particularly when we lock the blueprints, which I'm going to talk about in a second. When you lock a blueprint, it's this identity that we create and associate with the blueprint assignment that's responsible for all of the resources that it creates. So as you're updating those environments, you have an identity that's associated in doing all of those, all that resource management. The blueprint definition version, so we allow you to version these blueprints. I'll walk through this in a second, but it defaults to the latest blueprint version. And then the lock, which I'm going to talk about in a second as well. Underneath the basics section, you have your artifact parameters. So you're seeing all the different artifacts that we saw on the definition page. You're seeing those listed here. If you have any parameters that you need to fill out at assignment time, which is something that you can configure, you can fill that out right here. So an example would be if you have a tagging policy for a cost center, you won't know what that cost center is until you know the environment that you're deploying to. So you fill that out at assignment time. So we'll click Assign here and kick that process off. Obviously, we're deploying a bunch of artifacts here, and that takes some time. So when I get my beautiful green check mark, assuming things go well, I'll switch over to an assignment I've already done with the exact same resources. So this is what an assignment looks like. We're getting a status message saying that the assignment itself was successful. And then here are all the deployed artifacts. So in the case of like a virtual network, here's the actual VNet being deployed. It's no longer listed as a template. And all of these are live resources. We're in Azure, so I can click on one of these, and I'll get taken to the corresponding resource details page. OK, so that's the basics. A simple blueprint, a simple assignment. Let's level up a little bit. So let's go back to our blueprint definition that we created, and let's update it. We know these environments are not static. We know they're always changing. So let's say you need to add a new policy to the blueprint definition. Now you need to go and update all those corresponding blueprint assignments, again, to make sure those environments are up to date. So we just click Edit Blueprint. You cannot edit the blueprint name or the definition location where the blueprint is saved. That's something that we're looking into. And the definition location itself, that's a management group. So Liz talked about management groups as well. The blueprints themselves live at a management group scope. And let's switch over to the Artifacts tab. This is what the new and the edit experience looks like for blueprints. I can add an artifact at the subscription level. So for things like policy and RBAC, I can add those at the subscription level. And I can also add artifacts at the resource group. So let's go ahead and do that. When I click Add Artifact, I'm given the options of the artifacts that I'm allowed to add at this scope. I can add a policy assignment, a role assignment, or an ARM template. So let's add a policy assignment. And this is pulling in all the policies that I have access to at this scope, both my built-in policies and my custom policies. So I'll add this policy to audit VMs that don't use managed disks, and I'll hit save. When I save a blueprint, I'm saving it as a draft by default, so this doesn't accidentally get assigned before it's ready. You have to take an explicit action to publish a new version of a blueprint. So let's do that really quickly. So we'll call it version 1.2. We'll add some change notes, which can be helpful. So added audit policy for managed disks. And we'll hit publish. And this usually just takes a second. And now that we have a new blueprint definition version, let's go and actually update the corresponding assignment that we just kicked off. Let me just double check that the initial assignment is done, which it should be. Yep, so that first one's done. Let's go update it. One. So same assignment, and now we're going to update it. And we see here that we have a new definition version. So by default, it stays on the blueprint definition that we started at, but obviously we want to add that new artifact and get that deployed in our environment. So we're going to go to 1.2. And we see here we have our new policy that's listed here as we would expect. That's great. Before I assign, we're going to lock this assignment as well. So let's talk about locking for a second. So we know there are these cases where the app teams need to have owner access to do things like grant more access within that subscription. But we also know there are things that are in that subscription that the subscription owner should not be touching. Virtual networks are a great example. And historically, we've had management locks, but those could also be removed by the subscription owner. So there's sort of an easy way to get around that one. With locking assignment, that's no longer possible. The lock, again, it's part of the blueprint assignment. And what it says is that the only thing that can touch all of these resources are the managed identity that we've created that's associated with the blueprint assignment. So let's go ahead and update this and add a lock. And that succeeded. And again, that's going to take a little bit of time to go and add that new policy and then add all the locks. So let's go ahead and look at this one. This is a similar assignment that I've updated in the same way. So on the assignment details, you can actually see all the different assignment operations and what we did in each one of those assignment operations. So this is a really easy way to look at these particular assignments and make sure that it's updated with the latest blueprint version. We, of course, see our additional policy here. And what we also see here that's new is the lock state. The lock state has two different states associated with it. The first one here that you're seeing is read-only, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can't touch this resource. The owners cannot modify this resource whatsoever. The resource group gets a bit of a different lock. It says cannot edit, cannot delete. And what that means is that the resource group itself, you cannot edit, you cannot delete it, so you can't change tags or things of that nature. All the resources that the blueprint created within that resource group are also locked. But you can actually add new resources to the resource group. So we know there are lots of scenarios where you need the app teams or the people that are using this environment to be able to continue to add to this environment. So by default, the resource group, you can add more resources to it. This is sort of our initial pass at how locking works for a blueprint. We expect to have more configuration options to say, OK, completely lock down resource group A, but don't lock resource group B. So that's coming as part of advancing through our public preview. So that's the basics, right? We created a simple blueprint. We assigned it, no locks. We've updated that assignment, or updated that blueprint and updated the corresponding assignment and added the locks. And this is fairly basic portal usage. I think the UI in the portal can get you through quite a few scenarios, but we know that these blueprints are going to be managed as code and managed through source control and put through your release pipeline. So what I'm going to do is spend the rest of the demo talking about how you take these blueprints, model them as code, and get them deployed to Azure. So let me switch over to Visual Studio Code. So if you guys were at Corey's keynote and you saw Liz demo blueprints, the blueprint that she demoed was all done in code. None of it was done in the portal. So let's walk through what that blueprint structure looks like when it's in my source control. Here's my deep dive 2 blueprint. I have my blueprint.json here, which is the main blueprint file, which I'll walk through in a second. And then all the individual artifacts are listed as separate JSON files. So I have an RBAC assignment here, a second RBAC assignment, a policy, a template, another template. I'll walk through all of these. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, I have a PowerShell script that's actually calling the Blueprints API directly. It calls the API once for the main blueprint and once for each subsequent artifact. And what that allows you to do is manage the lifecycle of those artifacts separately, keep your artifacts modular, and ensure maximum reuse of all your artifacts, whether it be templates, policies, or RBAC assignments. So I have this compile script here. What it's doing is basically taking a look at what's in this folder. I supply the directory, which is deep dive 2. It runs through and structures an API call for each one of these artifacts and puts it in this file I have called puts.ps1. That just takes a second. And then I execute puts.ps1, which is actually doing all the API calls. And so this is, you're going to see the responses come back. It'll be one for each single artifact. So again, this just makes it really, really easy to model your blueprints in source control and update them over time. So that's done. Let's go and take a look at what this looks like. So there's our blueprint. Again, it defaults to draft. I would just have to publish this, and then we could assign it. But before I do that, I want to walk through a few sort of API exclusive features right now. They will be coming to the UI, but if you really want to get started in them right now, you can start to take advantage of them. The first one being blueprint level parameters. So the classic example is I have a region that I want to declare at the blueprint level, and I want that same region to cascade for all of my individual artifacts. That's something that we're doing here in our blueprint definition. I define a parameter just like I would in an ARM template. I can have allowed values, all the sorts of things that you would expect to be able to do. The other exclusive feature in the API right now is deployment sequencing. So right now there's a documented default deployment sequence for your blueprint definitions, which most of the time you probably won't have to touch. But if you do need to sequence things so that artifact A happens before artifact B, you can do that. So normally, because these run in alphabetical order, we'll deploy the management resource group, and then we'll deploy the networking resource group. But if we need the networking resource group to deploy first, we'll depend on this resource group. We'll depend on an artifact within the resource group. So I have this networking policy, and I have the name of my artifact here. So I'll go back to the blueprint. and add this depends on, and just save that. And then before I update this definition, the last thing is subscription level ARM templates. So some of you might have seen this week, actually, we started talking about ARM templates that are targeted at a subscription for things like role definitions and assignments, policy definitions and assignments. So I have an ARM template here that actually creates a policy definition. Here's my policy rule. So this just works with the API. It's probably a week away from showing up in the UI. So let's update this. And that gives you an idea of how easy it is to update. I'm just running 2 commands. All of this will be available in a GitHub repo that I'll show you at the end. So that's done. Let's refresh. Let's publish. We'll call this 1.0. And let's assign it. So IT retail prod. We won't lock it, but we'll assign it. So we're going to go and watch our assignment here and validate that the sequencing actually worked as expected. And it should take maybe 30 seconds. So it's in a waiting state just for a bit. It's in a queue. It's going to start operating in just a second. Of course, every time I tested this, it happened much faster than this. While this is going, I'll talk about some of the things that we're working on specifically for source control. So we are starting in the deployment now. We'll have PowerShell commandlets and CLI support. Right now I'm calling the API directly, but we'll have commandlets that'll make it much easier to model your blueprints as source control and get them deployed to Azure, as well as import and export your blueprints between tenants. So we know a lot of you are CSPs and MSPs and are going to be transferring those blueprints all over the place. So we're going to make that a lot easier for you. We see here that it ignored the default order and took the new sequence because the networking resource group deployed first. So the sequencing is working as expected, which is great. So that is everything I have to demo. Not bad, right? Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is our roadmap for blueprints. Obviously, we just got to public preview on Monday, and we have a ton of things that we want to do. The first one is more advanced assignment updates. So things like what-if analysis for your updates, as well as things like support for resource delete. If you remove a artifact from a definition, we should go and remove that resource. If you are using ARM a lot today, you know this is something you can't explicitly delete a resource, so this is something that we're going to be able to help out with. More advanced resource locking, I talked about this one. Pre and post deployment script execution. So we all know there's just that one thing that you can't do with an ARM template, so we're going to help you by allowing you to add a script both pre and post the blueprint assignment. More advanced sequencing. So right now you can sequence artifacts, but what we're going to allow you to do is pass outputs from one artifact into as inputs for another artifact, and that's going to open up quite a few scenarios. Better import, export, we talked about that, and support for assigning blueprints to a management group. There are a few scenarios here that we think are going to be really important, so we're going to support that, and then commandlets and CLI commands. The last thing I have are some resources. So the docs, aka MS, what are blueprints? Pretty easy, and that's going to take you to the overview, and you'll be able to see all the corresponding docs. This is my personal repo, and this is just where I keep track of all the things that I've demoed. So if you want to use that script to deploy your blueprints as code, it's all there. And then if you need me, you can just email me. I'm pretty responsive, so please do get in touch. You've seen the survey link quite a few times. Please fill it out. And then please evaluate this session. These ratings are really important to us. It tells us if any of this was actually worthwhile. And that's it. We'll stick around for Q&A. Thanks, everybody.